Welcome to the Action Network podcast presented by DraftKings. I'm your host, Mike Calabrese, and just like every single Wednesday, you can count on us here to give you PGA Tour coverage with Spencer Aguiar and Kyle Murray. We're going to dive in to the latest and greatest here on the PGA Tour. That means this week we are previewing the Valero Texas Open in beautiful San Antonio, Texas. Last week we were in H-Town, and we just had to go about 3 hours west on I-10 to get here. We're going to be able to hear from our illustrious panel here if any of those guys think that there's some Lone Star consistency in terms of the game. There are some overlaps between some of these courses in the state of Texas. Certainly, there's wind to consider. But there's, obviously other elements about this course that make it special. This is another one, course TPC San Antonio that is steeped in history. Walter Hagen, Byron Nelson, Hogan, Snead, Palmer, they all won here at least once. And this course is annually one of the top 10 toughest on, really across all of the PGA Tour. It consistently ranks as one of the hardest to hit greens in regulation, sitting alongside, Riviera, Harbor Town, TPC Southwind in that regard, with a greens in regulation rate hovering below 60% at 58%, which really speaks to the difficulty of this course. That's the constant. The variable, I mentioned it at the top, is the winds. When it's gusty, winners can struggle to get to double digits under par on this course. When it's calm, recent winners like Akshay Bhatia and Corey Connors both made it to 20 under or better. So we're looking at sustained winds in the 10 to 15 mile per hour range this week, plus thunderstorms that could create some stop and go play as well. But before we hop into your place here at the Valero, though, let's talk big picture because we're a third of the way through the PGA Tour season. So let me ask a two-parter for the both of you. Which golfer are you expecting to bounce back? You had larger expectations for them this season for whatever reason, injury, poor form, some bad timing, a few putts lip out. They don't quite hit those top 10, top 15s, maybe an outright winner that you expected at this point in their season. And on the other side of the totem pole, like, which golfer has just overachieved and now is the time to sell high on him? The market has overcorrected. The prices don't make sense vis-a-vis their skill set and the tracks that they're playing on. Spencer, let me kick it to you first for that two-parter.
I mean, I think the easy answer to give Michael of the player that you would expect to get it going, and I know he's won once already on tour, would be Scotty Scheffler. There has been this sentiment that has come around him over the last couple of weeks where, like, we could talk and we could make a whole episode about it, about the with and without Scotty markets and what they mean. And I've always been a proponent that you shouldn't be betting those markets. Like, it's better to just put Scotty in the field to begin with. A lot of the numbers that are baked in are already shown. And like, we're now seeing people with Scotty in the field, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens at the Masters because you have a golfer now that really has not played in a couple weeks, hasn't looked good when he has played. I don't know what the general public's going to do, but I think we're going to see Scotty return back to the stages of what we've gotten from him historically. Too good of a player. A lot of the iron stats, I think, have been a little bit flawed in some directions with it. I think for me on the opposite end of the equation, a lot of the answers that I always give with that, and it's not even just like one specific player, a lot of times you see names, whether they win or they do not win, you get these massive decreases in price. Like, I mean, we could almost go across the board with it with like any of these names that in the prior tournament, they top 10 the event and they go from 200 to 1 to win all the way down into these like 40 to 1 ranges. I mean, a name this week that would kind of check a lot of those boxes. Whether or not he does well is another story, but like John Kiefer, he's 200 to 1 plus last week. He provides a good top 5 finish. Now all of a sudden he's 30, 40 to 1. And I think these overcorrections that you see is just something that you have to be very cognizant of throughout the season. Like, I'm always running long-term data to try to find where does it make sense from a statistical perspective, and then add in the last 10 weeks of form. Like, I'm running this in 3 different ways of 3 main categories. It's the long-term statistical profile, it's a 10-week profile of your current form, and it's a 5-term out or 5-year outlook when it comes to course history there. So, I'm always going to kind of like condense everything into specific tournaments to see who should be over and underrated from it. Cause there's a lot of people that found success last week that are projected to find success again. Gary Woodland last week would be the prime example of that. I came on this show and I talked about liking Gary Woodland in matchups, and unfortunately didn't end up on an outright ticket with him because I thought the price was too short, which is kind of the counter argument to this, Michael, to where like sometimes they just win. But I think it's something to be aware of. Just be very aware of where numbers are moving and don't overreact to specific answers of it.
Kyle, in terms of that golfer that you want to sell high on, what's a name that comes to mind for you right now? As I mentioned, a third of the way through the PGA Tour season.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, I know this is going to be a fan favorite, someone who's, coming off of some pretty successful showing so far early on in 2026. But for me, I think it's going to be Bob McIntyre here. Again, I do think that he's someone who, when you look at his overall baseline over the last year and a half or so, I would say, I do think he's going to be someone who, does perform as, a top 25 to 30 player in the world, but as someone who currently ranks inside the top 12 of world golf rankings, I could see him potentially being someone who profiles as someone who could fall off a bit just due to some struggles with the ball striking. His approach play has been pretty poor. I do think that this week he's someone who could be fine if it does, find a windy week here because he is someone who has obviously been used to those conditions, played well in those conditions in the past, but he's been heavily reliant on the putting. And for a guy like him who does get a lot done that way, it's hard to take that away from him. But again, I'm someone who's always going to sort of consider that as a highly variant part of a skill profile in the golf world. And I prefer to find guys in terms of their elite ball striking to have more consistency over time. So that's someone who profiles to me as jumping off the absolute page in terms of a great putter right now. The putter has been great, but the ball striking has been up and down at best. His off the tee play has still been solid, but his approach play, his irons have been really, pretty off the radar at times, especially up and down. He did have a solid week at the Players, resulted in a top five finish, gained on approach there, but prior to that, four straight pretty bad losing weeks in terms of approach play. So do kind of wonder if he's someone that could potentially fall off if he isn't able to keep that putter going.
On the other end of the spectrum, there's the patience versus being stubborn. Obviously, the better way to look at it is you're patiently awaiting one of these golfers to play at their absolute ceiling. Hasn't materialized yet, but really that only
Yeah.
makes their price more interesting on a week-to-week basis. Who kind of checks that box for you?
Yeah, I mean, if anybody's been tuning in the past three or 4 weeks or so, Austin Spullerman is the guy who kind of fits the bill for me. I understand we have seen some peak performances from him, and I will say it's difficult for this particular conversation because I do think he profiles as someone who's going to be highly volatile in general. But in terms of somebody who has still yet to really exceed expectations in a big way. Again, he did have that T2 there at the Cognizant, but again, his approach profile has been so good. He grades out as the best approach player in this field for me this week, and obviously we do have a pretty star-studded field here, even though don't have a couple of the top players in the world, but still plenty of notable names there in the field, and he just continues to pop off the page in terms of his ball striking and his approach play. And again, sort of backing off of that Robert McIntyre conversation. Somebody that's going to value that quite a bit here. Again, the putting has been a downfall for him, so I continue to think there's going to be some struggles there, and that's going to lead to volatility. But in terms of somebody who I do think is going to cash somebody a big week, it might take until November when the fall season comes around, and we're not seeing as much action here in these PGA events. But I do think that he's someone that's going to break through at some point this season. Another big name that I think sort of fits that bill is Hideki Matsuyama. I mean, his ball striking has still been fairly consistent, just really hasn't had a ton of luck go his way. So he's another guy who I would continue to bet on potentially having a bounce back.
All right, let's get into the Oaks course here in San Antonio. I'll go to you first, Spencer. We talked about the difficulty of just putting the ball on the green. Obviously, that lends itself to the elite players in terms of being able to work around the green. Anything else that you want to flag for our listeners who may not be familiar with the track here?
You kind of talked about it at the beginning, Michael, of this being a very difficult tournament, and scoring averages here are going to reflect that. And if you look at this tournament as a whole, up until the last couple of seasons where players started to put a little bit more credence in actually playing this event the week before the Masters, one of the sentiments I've heard over and over again is this tournament ends up producing long shot winners. And you've seen all these triple digit names, but if you condense it to just the last 4 or 5 years, Corey Connors twice, Jordan Spieth, JJ Spawn. I understand like the Spawn's a 200 to 1+ number. And I understand like even when I hit Corey Connors in 2019, that was 250 to 1. Akshay won last year. Harmon, like there's a lot of names there that are either major championship winners, became really good players. I think that that's something that we have to pump the brakes on when it comes to long shots for this tournament. Like, this is a much different field during this iteration. Oberg, Henley, Fleetwood, Hideki, Siwoo, like all these names that are going to be entering this tournament with a lot more form. So For me, when I looked at this board, one of the things that I noticed, whether or not this ends up being right or wrong, I mean, we will see this week, but I thought a lot of the win equity did land with these names at the top, all those names I just talked about. And it's going to come down to around the green, big boost that you need. There's a 3.2% impact in around the green play. You talked about it at the beginning, Michael. There's almost a 10% decrease that you get in greens in regulation percentage. All of those major championship demanding preps that you would want to see from golfers are here. And if players view this as a little bit more of the situation that they want to test their game the week before, there's a reason why everybody's there. Wind is going to play a big factor. I think the one thing I will add to that, though, and I'll let Kyle talk about this course a little bit himself, but even in benign conditions, if you go to 2011, it's one of the best videos or worst videos, how depending on what your relationship is to Kevin Na. There's a Kevin Na video where he made a 16, and that's in rather benign conditions to where he got it stuck into the trees, into the bushes. He couldn't get himself out. It's a challenging course. It really demands an entire outlook across the bag that you need to find success. And you see that with the proximity numbers. There's really no dispersion in expectation in any of those 25-yard buckets from 100 yards and beyond. Like everything yields over a 10% rate. That's not usually what ends up happening. So you got to be good around the entire bag. You have to be good around the green. Putting is kind of one of those things that Kyle and I talk about every single week that for me, I'm trying to find golfers that have upticks in their expectation on specific green complexes. And it's going to be no different for this weekend. There's names that we'll talk about as we move across the show. Distance, accuracy, what you're looking for off the tee, that's kind of the tricky one here. It's been very challenging for players to separate themselves off the tee at this course. A lot of that is you have these really tough to hit fairways. And this year might be the most interesting part of the conversation. There's a lot of rain that has hit that area. It's going to be lush rough. I've heard that it's going to be thicker rough than we normally get because of that rain and just what they're trying to do in general. So I would be aware of that as I'm building a model. I still think at the end of the day, the difficulty to separate off the tee is not necessarily going to be the end all be all for me. Like I want to find guys that are good with their short games. I want to find guys that are good with their proximity numbers. And if you're bad in one of those areas, you better kind of be good everywhere else. And that's how I built my model this week.
Kyle, I'd love to hear your thoughts overall on this course, but let's double click into wind for a moment. The Action Network app allows you to have indicators that pop off for sports like baseball, certainly for college football and the NFL. Once we hit that 15 mile per hour threshold, all of a sudden the downfield passing game goes out the window. In terms of your modeling, is there a cutoff, a point where all of a sudden, some of the other stats aren't as useful because of the variables with the winds? Obviously, it's not the same if you're heading into it, if it's a crosswinds. How deep in the weeds do you get with the wind and its impact on this field?
Yeah, I mean, I will say there have been certain times where, the wind does feel pretty apparent. There's, even times where you can go on certain forecast systems and find wind direction, maybe factor those in based on different holes. I think those weeks usually come when it's, the very severe wind sort of forecast. I usually don't do that until Wednesdays at the probably the earliest, just because I feel like there have been times for rains as well, but mostly for wind, where you do all this work to, see what the wind is looking like, and then the forecast is entirely different. So I do tend to think that it's, best to wait as long as you can for actually getting an up-to-date forecast. And again, forecast can be wrong, it happens all the time. But nonetheless, I think for me that 10 mile per hour mark is sort of the cutoff. I do also think that sustained versus gust is important. I think a lot of people talk about that in the NFL as well. So that's going to be something that I'll also be looking into. But for me, I think in terms of looking at the way to profile a player, the way I like to do it in windy conditions is take their base profile based on whatever stat I'm looking at. Usually for windy conditions, it's mainly ball striking stuff off the tee and approach, then create a delta and find the difference between that and then them in certain windy conditions. The BetSperts rabbit hole tool has a great conditions filter that you can use. That's one I like to use quite a bit. So, you can do different things like that. That's what I'll be using in my model this week, is that delta differential number there between these guys in, regular conditions versus their numbers in windy conditions over 10 miles an hour. They also have, ways to filter up to, I believe, 18 miles per hour or over. And again, I think the forecast later on in the week is going to be more indicative and probably more predictive as we get, closer to actually teeing off for this event. But I do think it's certainly going to be important. I mean, we talked about some of the difficulties of hitting greens in regulation. Obviously, one of the more difficult courses in that regard on the tour. And obviously, I'm assuming that that's part of the reason why is the wind, is that's factoring into these guys. Obviously, difficult complexes, smaller greens in general. Also, the softness of the greens is just not there at all. Obviously, very, very firm, very hard greens, tough to hold. So you take all that in. And also, the windier it gets, the more dried out these greens are going to become. So I think obviously the wind also plays factor into that. I think that's a big reason why we saw the Brian Harman win last year come in at 9 under. We have seen some low numbers here over the years. I think over the past 3 or 4 weeks since we've been doing the show, I think in terms of the spread of final scores here for these winners, this is probably the one with the most volatility, or at least one of them. So I think that's also something worth considering. So for me, I think you guys obviously nailed it. Scrambling is one of the more important stats for me this week. It's around the green play is the most important this week as it's been in a model for me all season so far, since 2010 at this event, and then scaling up to the last 5 years. 20% of strokes gained in this event have come around the green, which is a pretty massive number considering typically we see a lot of strokes gained by, putting performances, especially when you're looking at post event results there, and then obviously ball striking as well. So to see this around the green number, 20% of strokes gained is a pretty big number. So it's going to be something that I'm certainly looking at. Obviously, Spencer mentioned the scrambling. And I do agree with him as well. We can certainly see some big numbers here without wind. I do think accuracy is very important off the tee, but we're going to see guys just sort of have trouble regardless of the wind. But I do think that from a ball striking perspective off the tee, the missed fairway penalty is fairly high because of these trees, but the rough isn't too difficult. So for me, I think approach play per usual and around the green is going to be kind of the big two driving forces this week.
So we got a feel now for the course here in San Antonio. Let's jump right into the head-to-head market. Spencer, you're up first. You like Eric Cole minus 120 over Power. Now this one's interesting because Cole has not been in the greatest form. He doesn't grade out particularly well when you talk about his play off the tee and his long irons, but he is 12th on tour in strokes gained around the green. And as we just laid out, this Oaks course rewards skilled players around the green. It certainly gives you a leg up. Is that where you started with this handicap between Cole and Power?
Yeah, I think a lot of these answers, and Kyle and I keep hitting on this over and over again, and I really like the way that he explained even the win factor to it. Like it's something that you should be considering as you're building a model or as you're trying to run stats, is you're not just running basic statistics where you're trying to find some very straightforward answer. Like every single time that you ask a question or you get a model to build an answer for you, you should be trying to base it off of a course specific outlook. How do players perform in windy conditions over 10 miles per hour, if that's where you want to start there? How do players perform on specific green complexes? How do players perform when they're at a long course versus a short course? It's everything that you're trying to do is you are taking a baseline statistic from an overall profile, and does a player get better or worse depending on the specific factors of what you're getting for a course. And you talked about it, Michael, when it comes to Eric Cole here. Like the off the tee stuff is going to look really brutal inside of any model. Like he's 120th in my model in expected strokes gained off the tee. But for me, I talked about it a little bit at the beginning here. I think this is a hard course to separate. And if there is a problem to this play, it could be that you have really thick rough. He's not long. He's not accurate. It's maybe an ability to where off the tee should be pushed up even a little bit more than I have it. But what really surprised me inside of my model is despite some of the long iron proximity not being where you would want it to be, and where some of the off the tee stuff is not where you want it to be whatsoever, he's still graded as a top 25 golfer for me in both weighted strokes gained total and then in your in-tournament correlations, which is just how frequently can somebody produce those same metrics. And it comes down to all of those short game statistics. Like he's a top 5 projected performer for me with the putter. That's a positive upside mark. He's also the number 2 overall player for me when I recalculated this leaderboard in short game production. And if you flip the script here and you just look at the Seamus Power profile, there's a lot of negatives on the Seamus end of it too. It's a golfer that's outside of the top 70 for me when it comes to expectation off the tee. It's a golfer that when you look at some of these statistics for the putter, he has been terrible on similar golf green complexes throughout his career. If you just look here specifically, he's only made the cut once in 5 attempts. He's averaged negative 1.23 shots putting per round over those 12 tournaments. And while the around the green stuff looks good for him, and like there's certainly something that why you can figure out how he could find success to be even par if he's able to put some of the pieces together. I don't see as many of the scoring opportunities of what Cole brings to the table. There's negative ends of the marks on both of them, and there's not the same positive marks that Power brings that what Cole brings. And it's not the same answer as last week when I gave Woodland over Poston, because like the Poston profile was just bad across the board and the Woodland profile was very boom or bust across the board. That's not exactly how I would describe this one. I think there's volatility on both ends of it. I just don't see where the upside comes into play on Seamus's profile. And I think there's a downside that's like inherently built into it when you model it. And for Cole, there are a lot of top 30 expectations in different iterations of this build. So I'm going to bet Eric Cole here. Like I said, I think there's volatility. This is not a golfer that's been in perfect form. A lot of the stuff that I've talked about on this show, Michael, like when I try to backtrack stuff and figure out where players should have actually been for every single tournament, it's like bad versus bad. Every single week that I look, even when they make the cut, both of them, Seamus should be in like 90th place before the cut, and he's making the weekend, and Cole has had a very similar answer. I just think the short game for him is going to end up providing a benefit that Seamus does not have with the putter.
From two golfers that are struggling to the very top of the board, you are circling a matchup between two top five guys from an outright perspective here in a head-to-head. Kyle, you're going with Russell Henley over McIntyre, who you mentioned the reason why you think it's the right time to fade him. He's maybe a bit overvalued in the market, but talk to me specifically about Henley and what you like.
Yeah, I will say it's always frustrating to, bet these sorts of matchups when you're facing a guy who is so live or die with the putter, because then you look up and he's through 9 or 10 holes and he has like 120 feet made of putts, and then you're just, tilting your face off. But in terms of the baseline here between these two guys, it's a pretty substantial difference here. I have Russell Henley as the second best player this week in this field in terms of the way he grades out at this course, and I have Robert McIntyre, and admittedly, I am probably lower on him than most people who are, modeling, or obviously the books making numbers here for McIntyre, who I have as the 18th best player in this field. So I'm certainly willing to, stand on that hill here with this matchup. But I think Russell Henley provides a nice floor here as well. Obviously, we've talked about him throughout the past few weeks as well, and his complete game sort of top to bottom. He's been very consistent all season long, especially early on so far in 2026. So Russell Henley is someone who I'm more than happy to back, especially in these head-to-head markets. And unfortunately, like I said, I like Bobby McIntyre, but he's someone that I'm looking to fade here. So I'm going to take Henley in the matchup market here.
Before we move on, do not forget to sign up for Action Pro for real-time pick alerts from experts like myself, Kyle Murray, Spencer Aguiar, and the rest of our Action Network expert team. Plus, you can also access our pro projections powered by Sean Kerner and our predictive analytics team. Just go to actionnetwork.com/pro and get $20 off the annual price with the promo code POD20. So don't miss out on the best bets at the best prices. Visit actionnetwork.com/pro and use promo code POD20 to get $20 off a year of Action Pro. Before we get to the rest of the show, let's toss it over to Sean Zerillo for a quick word from our sponsor, DraftKings.
The Action Network podcast is sponsored by DraftKings Sportsbook, where new customers can bet $5 and get $200 back in bonus bets instantly. Love the thrill of live betting. DraftKings has got you covered. Bet live on star player props and in-progress games right as they happen. To get started, use promo code Action Network when signing up at DraftKings. And again, use code Action Network when signing up and bet $5 to get $200 back in bonus bets instantly. The crown is yours.
It's placement wager time, guys. Let's get into it with yours first up, Spencer. Thorbjorn Olesen. Nailed that. Feeling good about that. Put that right on the green. Not easy this week. Last two go-arounds here, by the way, this guy has dominated this course. 11th and 5th in terms of his finishes. He looked really good at the Houston Open, and now he is here again in the Lone Star State on another tree-lined, wind-exposed, accuracy premium kind of course. So it makes sense to me, but talk me through the exact placement window that you're looking for him here to land.
I mean, if I could like make it more specific than that, even I'd probably prefer him in matchups over anything else. I actually thought he drew a lot of great opponents in the matchup market. We talked positively about Tony Finau last week. My model didn't necessarily see the same benefits from him during this go around. almost across the board with Finau. And I'd be curious to hear what Kyle's numbers are on Finau, since I think he was even higher on Finau last week than I was. But like recalculated proximity for Finau in this tournament, he's 82nd. The really alarming one, like if you start taking away scoring opportunities, I know I said it's hard to separate, but 117th for me was the expected weighted off the T grade. The around the green stuff looks really good, and you kind of always see that with Finau at similar courses. So I guess that would be the one concern, but the putter has a little bit of negative trajectory. Not much. There's not really much of a difference one way or another with it. But if you're telling me that this is an answer where the iron play gets negative from the baseline, the off the tee play gets negative from the baseline, the putting gets slightly negative, like those are a lot of negative answers for a golfer. And Olesen, as you just talked about, where there's safety built into the profile from what you've seen from him at this tournament with back-to-back quality finishes at this course. And he also comes into this tournament with a top 15 in his prior start. And for me, I'm never going to overweight what we have seen in the prior tournament for all the reasons we've already talked about. But he continues to pop up my model. Like for me, I have him as a top 20 projected win equity golfer. For Finau, he's outside of the top 50 for me. So I think there's a lot of different ways to play that. And then the other one I'll throw out, which I think is maybe even a little bit more volatile, which would be a negative answer, which is why I didn't give this one. I don't actually have a ticket on it right now, but is Olesen over Penge. Kind of a lot of the same reasons that come into play. So for me with Olesen, I do have an outright ticket on him at 62-1. I kind of prefer this though in any of your safety markets of what you can get, whether that's, a top 30 on the board. I think that's a really nice look for him. Or if you do want to take some of these specific matchups where you can get him on a 1v1, I think in tournament bets make a lot of sense for that same answer too. I'll probably be trying to target him across the board in round 1 and round 2 matchups and kind of just see where the stats go there. And hopefully if I can keep getting prices, continue that throughout the week. Cause that's kind of was my stance with Woodland last week. Didn't get the outright ticket on him, but continued to bet him after every single round. Like he shoots 6 under par and he got matched up in round 2 against Davis Thompson at minus 104 over on DraftKings, and thought that was a very natural spot. And I know Kyle had talked about Thompson being a fade for him last week. And it's kind of, you build these narratives of players, whether they're positives or negatives. And as the stats start coming in, they start swaying a little bit more in one direction. But when the narrative continues on a name like Woodland or the negative of Davis Thompson, when you can find those examples, like that's always what I'm trying to find. So I think Olesen will probably be a name I'm going to be attacking quite a bit this week.
The hell with buy and low. Just keep going with golfers that are hot, Kyle. A great showing last week at the Valspar for Jordan Smith. He's an elite ball striker. In fact, he's third on tour in that stat behind Morikawa and Fitzpatrick. Are you looking at top 20, top 10, a ladder strategy? How are you targeting and trying to money manage when it comes to Jordan Smith?
Yeah, I like Smith here in the top 20 market. Spencer kind of alluded to this earlier, but it does feel like some of the win equity is pretty bundled up here at the top. There's a couple of guys that I don't mind taking stabs at down the board a bit, but for the most part, I do think that the winner's probably going to come from the top 5 to 10 guys sort of here in the outright market. So prefer Smith here in the top 20. You mentioned it, really solid ball striker. I have him as the 6th best tee to green player in my blended model. So I think he's someone who obviously checks that box. The around the green number, I do think that he's someone who certainly has not been influencing, some solid strokes gain numbers there in that market, but he also hasn't been killing himself there either in that department. So I think that he's someone that could sort of have a spike week in terms of the around the green play and the scrambling. The short game is something that I do think sort of holds me back from a potential outright market play here for Jordan Smith, but nonetheless, it's the off the tee and the approach play that leads me to him here. And like you mentioned, the solid finishes as of late. Obviously, the third place finisher at the Valspar. He had a nice 16th place finish back at the Waste Management Open. T23 at the Cognizant. So he's been kind of in or around this top 20 over the past 5 starts quite a bit. So I think there's some pretty solid value here still on this 3-1 number here for a top 20 finish for Jordan Smith.
Let's get into some of your favorite outrights to win this tournament this weekend, presented by DraftKings. Spencer, we already heard a bit from Kyle about Russell Henley, why he likes him. There are 9 players in this field that rank top 40 in all four of these categories: strokes gained on approach, strokes gained around the green, fairways gained, and bogey avoidance. And Russell is one of them. His price has dipped a little bit. I think at the peak in this market it was about 20 to 1. I think it's down to about 16 to 1. Where's your cutoff for Henley, and how confident are you that he is going to be in contention come Sunday?
So I wrote this up very early in the week. I thought proper for him was 15 to 1. So I still think at 16 to 1, you're getting very thin there, but there's still a little meat on the bone. There's a lot of names that are very similar. There's not too big of a disparity between, I don't know, the number one guy to Siwoo Kim, who would be the number five guy for me. Like, I mean, you're looking at about 8 points in any given direction with it. But the one answer that I want to be made crystal clear is when I have Russell Henley at 15 to 1, and a lot of those names are similar, you're kind of seeing where a lot of this win equity starts shooting for me. And it's, like I said, it's to the very top. There are a lot of these names in that next tier, whether that's a Thorbjorn Olesen. Feel like we've talked about Mac Meisner on this show 1,000 times, but Mac Meisner, I will throw my name into the hat here of trying to pronounce a name that I shouldn't be trying to do, Michael. And I don't know if I'll do it as successfully as you did with Thorbjorn, but Adrian Dumont de Chassart. I took him at 105 to 1. That was the one long shot ticket that I ended up really punching this week outside of the Olesen at 60 to 1 and then Henley at the top there. But I like the Jordan Smith call. I like Yella Majaru. Like, there are a lot of names to consider at the end of the day. I just think the winner is going to come at the top. And for me with Henley, the profile is so crystal clear across the entire board. You talked about all the categories that he ranked well in. Like, if I run this in my model, I have 7 main statistical categories. So it's like, there's a lot more that goes into it than what meets the eye on these, but like weighted strokes gained total, in event correlation. I took specific tracks that are similar. So like TPC properties and on all of that. I took wind play when it's over 10 miles per hour, just like Kyle did. I took long courses, projected proximity plus the around the green stuff, and then weighted scoring, which is just an entire encapsulation of how players perform on specific properties that mimic these. The worst grade that I have from Russell Henley in those 7 categories would be weighted scoring, which is number 8. He is number 1 in weighted strokes gained total. He's number 1 in event correlation. He's number 2 on strokes gained total at long courses. And that comes from a golfer who's not extremely long off the tee. There's a reason why he's found success in the past at a tournament like the Masters. Augusta has a lot of comp corollary trends of what you're going to see here. They're trying to get players prepared. There's a reason why, in my opinion, Henley has a top 5 finish at this course. I think he is so much better than what the market actually believes him to be on a weekly basis. And like, if I was to give another answer of a name that I think has more in the bag than what we've seen, other than just like a very basic Scotty is really good at golf, which everybody knows, almost on a weekly basis, no matter where we throw Russell Henley, he's a value in my model. And for him to be number 1 and, pushing 15 to 1, I think that speaks volumes about the skill set that he has.
All right, Kyle, let me tee you up for your 2 winners this week. You like Tommy Fleetwood at 16 to 1. He's been knocking on the door basically this whole season. Tied for 4th at Pebble, tied for 7th at the Genesis, tied for 8th at the Players in his last start. He's also elite in wins, which we can't bang the drum hard enough this week in San Antonio and the impact there. But then you're calling your shot here, 64 to 1 on Sudarshan Yelamaraju. Nailed it. He's a bit of a unicorn. I'm not just talking about the name here. He's the only golfer in the field who ranks top 10 simultaneously in both driving distance and stroked gain on approach. 64 to 1 has my full attention. Why don't we start with Sudarshan first?
Yeah, I mean, kind of similar to Jordan Smith, right? Kind of, you could say buying high here, but at 64 to 1 in a field that, like we mentioned, still does have some solid, stars here, but, we're not seeing, the full Rolodex of PGA Tour players here. So I think that 64 to 1 for this sort of event does sort of catch my eye here for some value. You mentioned some of the finishes that he's had as of late. I do think that could potentially lead to some noise in terms of the strokes gained around, around, or I guess across the board. But for me, when trying to reduce some of that noise and stretch it out in terms of stuff that we can actually pull from, he grades out as a top 10 player in this field for me. So at 64 to 1, I'll take a stab there. And then you mentioned Tommy Fleetwood. Yeah, the wind is a huge factor for Fleetwood. I think the windier it gets, the better of a bet he becomes. Obviously, betting on him as the favorite here. I haven't found myself betting on the favorite in tournaments all that much this year, but Tommy Fleetwood grades out as the top player in my model. He's not too far ahead of Henley or Siwoo Kim here for me in the top three, but so all those guys do check some boxes. But for Fleetwood, we've talked about the ball striking, we've talked about the wind. He's second in around the green performance for me in my model this week. So I think in terms of all the important stuff that I'm looking at, he grades out exceedingly well. Top 10 approach, number one in tee to green, number two in around the green, and number 10 in approach fit here, which is grading out, hole by hole construct and also wind direction and as well as wind conditions, depending on how windy we do see this course end up becoming. But yeah, for me, Fleetwood is checking so many boxes, so I'm happy to bet on him as the favorite this week.
Now, DraftKings has the best numbers when it comes to betting golf, and it also has just a multitude of markets and not just for the majors. So we're going to close out with a DK special here. They have a Group C winner that they're calling it. We got Ricky Fowler, we got Spawn, Straka, Mitchell, Michael Thorbjornsen. You can correct me on that one. In terms of their price, walk me through who you like. So give me the golfer, give me the price, and a reminder, you just go to specials over on DK under their golf tab, and you're going to be able to pick a golfer out of this five-some. I'll kick it to you first, Kyle.
Yeah, it's a pretty close group here. Obviously, DraftKings did a good job grouping some of these guys up together, but I do like Sepp Straka here at this plus 305. I think again, we've talked a bit over the course of the year, like where Ricky Fowler can potentially, look really solid, and I think this week could be one that could, be a chance to fade him here in this group particular, where he's obviously the favorite, so that adds some value across the board. JJ Spawn's been pretty volatile. For me, it would be between Straka and Thorbjornsen. Mitchell slightly behind those two guys, but for me, Straka gets a nice boost here. Again, another player that if the windier it gets, the better of a bet he becomes. For me, I have him as the best win player above his baseline in this field. Tom Fleetwood there at second. So when you talk about those two guys in terms of the way that they improve in windy conditions compared to the field and compared to their baseline, that goes a long way for me here. So I like Straka at this plus 305 number.
Obviously, for a special, futures market like this, it's not just the golfer, it's also the price. So which combination really struck your fancy, Spencer?
I think Kyle talked about it. It's a very difficult market. Like all players of the five there are inside of the top 18 of my model. So for me, it comes down to price point of where I would want to land. Mitchell is intriguing at plus 380. My concerns with Mitchell is that he doesn't have the best win equity. We've seen that he's won one time in his career. And because I think that this is such a robust group of names that you're going to probably have to push this further up the leaderboard. I know this is a boring answer to give after like repeating what Kyle just said, but I think the best combination of price plus upside is probably Sepp Straka at plus 305. I don't see a massive difference, as I said. Like, to me, my least favorite would be JJ Spawn at plus 380. He would be the 18th player in my model, all the way up to the sixth player in my model at the very best of it. So, I mean, you're kind of close there, but I think with what we've seen with Straka, you can see positive movements in the market from him at any sharp location. Like, he's moving in the right direction in matchups, outrights. I think there's a lot to like about Sepp Straka. And then if you want a little bit of a bigger ticket, my second name would be Keith Mitchell at plus 380.
Well, there you have it. Sepp Straka to win Group C over on DraftKings Sportsbook. The crown is yours. That'll do it for today's episode. Thanks for tuning in here to the Action Network podcast. Be sure to go over to actionnetwork.com and the Action app for all of our great golf betting and DFS content. And even better, sign up for Action Pro. You're going to get the best bets at the best prices. That's actionnetwork.com/pro. Use promo code POD20 for $20 off an annual subscription. That's promo code POD20 over at actionnetwork.com/pro. You can find Spencer on X at TOffSports and Kyle at KMurDFS. They're on the same handles on our free award-winning Action Network app. For Spencer Aguiar and Kyle Murray, I'm Mike Calabrese. Thank you so much for tuning in. Best of luck with all your bets this weekend. We'll be sure to see you at the window. Thanks for listening to the Action Network podcast. As always, presented by DraftKings.